welcome to the second of 6 sessions in the Sargent Shriver Program for Public Service Leadership. These are our case study seminars where we are examining the creation of the Peace Corps as an exercise in understanding not only Sargent Shriver's expression of public service leadership and his mode of operating, but also as a way of understanding how you practically and tangibly create change and build an infrastructure and work with the bureaucracy and amass both the participants and the political and social capital to carry that out effectively. Today's session, as you can see up here, is called The Seeds of a Promise, Shriver and the Beginnings of the Peace Corps. We will be filming this session again, as we will the others in our series this fall. So if you missed last week's session, you can catch that online. I think most of you were here for last week's session, which was tremendous. And I have no doubt that today's will be equally as interesting and will also benefit from the contributions of all of you as we move to discussion and problem solving at some key points. But I know it's going to be terrific today, in part because we're pleased once again to have our key partners and the driving forces in this whole project with us. Jamie Price, who is the Executive Director of the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute and is on faculty at George Mason, where he's led an Institute for Insight and Conflict Resolution. He is also an alumnus here of the University of Chicago's Divinity School. And many of you will know and recognize from last year Bill Josephson, who is the founding counsel of the Peace Corps, also a University of Chicago alumnus. He is a retired partner at Fried Frank in New York, has an amazing career in public service, worked for the administration of Mayor John Lindsay, more recently in the Attorney General's office in New York, and has been a leading advocate not on behalf of charities and compliance in that particular realm of law, but also as an expert in a whole range of constitutional electoral law. Has written some tremendous pieces most recently on Senate rules, actually, that speak to the current divide in our Congress. So he is a font of wisdom about many, many things, especially Sargent Shriver's life, career, and work. So we're going to delve into his knowledge and Jamie's knowledge in today's session. But before we do that, I wanted to give an opportunity for a few of our Shriver Fellows from the 2015 class of Shriver Fellows to talk a bit about their experience. These fall sessions are part of a larger program in public service leadership that includes and leads up to the next phase. And the next phase will begin in January and continue through spring quarter, and provides an opportunity for a select group of undergraduates to build on the learnings and the insights that these sessions will hopefully uncover for you, to actually apply that in service of solving a problem facing Chicago today. So let me first turn it over to this group of Shriver Fellows who we're always happy to have back here to talk just a little bit about that experience. And I don't know who would like to begin in this group. Tyler, do you want to begin? And then we can bounce it over to the core Chicago Peace Corps.
Yeah. Sure. Where should I start?
Start with why you decided to become a fellow.
Well, 2 reasons. First was these workshops last fall, and particularly hearing Kirby Jones speak at the last session, talking about the slivers of change, that the Peace Corps and his work in the Dominican Republic might have been only one sliver of change, but over the 220,000 Peace Corps volunteers in the last 50 years, it had really made a profound difference. And so I wanted to, with the idea of the program, was to be able to do that here in Chicago. And start a program that would offer the ability to make slivers of change throughout the city, and that would ultimately, over the long run, have made a profound impact.
That's great. Maddie, what about you?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I also came to the sessions and was kind of blown away by the life of Sarge and the sort of method of change. I didn't know anything about anything coming in, but I didn't know anything about Sarge in particular. And it was, it grabbed me instantly, but then once we went through the sort of in-depth look in the winter and spring at Sarge's life, and I read the book and everything, Read the book, everybody. It's really good.
Scott Stossel biography.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Scott Stossel biography.
We have copies.
We can get you the book.
Not only did I sort of love working with the cohort and love learning how to make that change in Chicago, but it was also a really great experience because it really, Sarge's method really applies on an individual level too, and you can kind of think about the way he goes about change, but also just connecting with other people in a way that is not about who he is as a person and so much more about anyone else around him. And I think that's one of the things that makes him such an effective leader and is so great to learn from. So that was like probably the biggest thing I got out of the fellowship, and then being part of the IOP community was huge.
So Jimmy and Graceland, I'll have you talk, if you don't mind, just for a minute or two about what the fellowship experience was like. You are a guinea pig class, so you have great insights about what that experience is like and what the potential is for future students.
It was amazing, in a word. But it was, for me, I joined the fellowship class after a year spent abroad in South America, and feeling like I wanted to engage in a way that I never before done with Chicago. And the fellowship allowed me to do that. We delved into Chicago issues, we studied and tried to figure out how Sarge's method of problem solving would apply to different Chicago problems that are especially relevant today, and that were actually relevant as well 50 years ago when Sarge was active. And so I feel like one of the gifts that the fellowship has given me is just a deeper relationship with the city, which I can't replace that.
Yeah, that's great. Graceland, why should future students consider following in your footsteps and applying for the fellowship?
They should definitely consider applying. I don't know if they should follow my footsteps.
You see, I don't know there.
I think this is, and I'm very grateful to be involved in a lot of things with the IOP. I think this is the coolest opportunity to be creative and kind of like action-oriented, because we do a lot of speaker events, a lot of stuff that's around the theory and reflecting on what is happening in the world, but the opportunity to really make waves of change of your own, I think, is one that's here and in the university in various places. I think it's really well done through this program. And I think the amount of time and resources and knowledge that we were given was incredibly helpful for me as an individual, but also really lent itself to building a program that I could be really proud of.
Yeah, I mean, and you guys built it. We didn't tell you what to do. I know you have one quick thing, and then I'll get to Ivan really quickly. Yes?
Oh, I would just add that I can't think of any other program that would allow 12 undergrads to just go out and identify and solve a problem, saying you've got the support of the University of Chicago Institute of Politics and the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute. Like, find it, identify it, build the solution. Like, that's an amazing opportunity. It was daunting, but it was also incredibly exciting.
That's great. That's great. So, Ivan, let me give you the last word to talk about what you and the fellows came up with and what you're doing now as a result of the program.
Right, so basically, we had these 2 quarters where we had seminars, we met every Friday morning and talked about Chicago. And so the whole summer, there's sort of like, make a project now. Now, we've taught you these skills, we've talked about the city, now go out and do something. So what we ended up making was the Chicago Peace Corps, and it's now housed under the Institute of Politics. And we do restorative justice in the back of the Arts neighborhood. And restorative justice is this technique that was devised by community organizers as an alternative to suspension, expulsion, CPS, because if you look at really the rates that people in South and West Side communities are expelled and suspended out of school, and the relationship between that and the amount of people in prison, there's a strong link between those two. So people are really thinking about ways, how can we get these kids to stay in school, to really care about their lives and not feel like they have to go out and sell drugs in a gang or fight over gang territory. So we do that in schools, the back of the yards, and then we supplement our work with tutors and after school programming. And so we do that every week. A few of us go out there, and it's awesome. And it's the type of thing where we never would have come to it without this program. We never would have had the resources and the backing and the confidence to go out and actually try to make these connections without the IOP and Jamie and Bill Josephson. So thank you guys.
Thank you guys. And I'll say, just from our experience, I think that not only did we learn a tremendous amount in the process about the program and how we can continue to deliver experience that's great for students. You taught us a tremendous amount about what's possible, and your work has inspired us. So we're looking forward to the next class of Shriver Fellows. I would encourage everybody in this room who is connected to undergraduates to encourage people to apply to come to these seminars. It's essential, and the seminars that is, and I think the program is tremendous. So we'll have more. The applications will be widely publicized and open. We'll be selecting fellows as we get to the end of November, and then the fellowship program will begin in January. So any questions about that before we jump in? Okay. So some of you may be saying, why in the world are you devoting 6 weeks to this guy, Sargent Shriver? And I'd love to begin with that premise as the first question. So Bill is somebody who worked as closely with him as anybody. Why Sargent Shriver?
Well, it's a great question to begin with. You know, I'd like to start actually with his death, with his funeral, if you don't mind, because most of us had thought that he was the forgotten man of American politics. The funeral proved us to be incredibly wrong. First of all, there were editorials across the nation and indeed in the world about what a remarkable person this was, the integrator of the Chicago Public Schools, the creator of the Peace Corps, the sponsor of the war against poverty, someone who played a material role in trying to end the war in Vietnam, the founder of the Special Olympics International. Not that Eunice hadn't created the Special Olympics, but it's Sarge who made it not just a national, but an international institution. So the funeral turned out to be a joyous event, as only Catholic funerals can be if everybody there is certain that they're at the funeral of a saint. You know, 15 religious leaders, including 2 cardinals, singing songs. More than 400 people, President Clinton, Vice President Biden, Majority Leader Pelosi, an all-star cast. So it made me understand in a way that I had not understood or realized before that this person for whom I had tremendous respect was not just my friend and my mentor, but somebody whom the world understood as a very important person. And the question becomes why? You know, why is not just a matter of achievement. Achievements are important. You can look at my resume and you can say, wow, what a resume, which some people say. But what is much more important are questions of character, questions of foresight, questions of value, energy, indomitability. These are all qualities that Sarge had. Think about it. He was handed a series of problems that were virtually unprecedented. And he accepted the challenge in every case. And to an extraordinary degree, he accomplished what he set out to accomplish. Some people say, with some justice, for example, that the war against poverty was a failure. But Tyler, who turns out to be the most indefatigable and curious researcher one could imagine, Tyler has unearthed what no other historians of the war against poverty have unearthed. Detailed plans, costed out detailed plans in 1966 and 1967 for ending poverty in America. No historian of the war against poverty or of Shriver have found these documents. Tyler has found them, and they will form the basis of a complete reevaluation of this man. So, Sarge had another quality that is also extremely Catholic, and I emphasize the degree to which his faith molded him. He was selfless. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yep.
He never did anything for himself. In fact, he never had any money. He was always borrowing. And his family, though, you know, very respectable and well-to-do, lost everything in the Depression. So he was a scholarship boy in prep school, a scholarship boy at college, a scholarship boy in law school. And he brought no money to his career. Here's a story that not even you know.
Try me.
In the course of our professional relationship, which developed into an extraordinary friendship, I had occasion to go to the park agency, as the Joseph P. Kennedy Holding Company was then called. And I'm sitting there chatting for the first time with the wonderful man who was Joseph P. Kennedy's right hand in running this agency for many, many years. And somehow we got onto the subject of how come Sarge has no money? And he says, well, you know, he does have no money, and what we've done, as a matter of fact, we've created a loan fund for him. And we've backed it with $1 million insurance policy on his life, so that when he dies, the money he gets as a loan will be repaid. That's a story you didn't know.
That's good. Well, and Jamie, from your perspective, as somebody who has been steeped in understanding the way in which he worked in the world and the roots and seeds of conflict and of peace building, why Shriver, from your perspective?
From my perspective, and you can't do better than talk about Sarge than the way Bill does. I mean, everybody who knew him fell in love with him the way Bill has, and that's why the outpouring when he died was so strong. And it was partly because he was saintly and selfless, but also because what he did, as Bill suggested, worked. And what he represented is something that 50 years now later, we almost think is impossible. With the world, with our country so polarized, with politics so cynical, it's hard to believe that a life of public service or could really matter. I mean, but there's a way that Sarge not only represented, but had an example of how to work in the world, work in the public sector in a world that actually brings people together, that actually makes things better, that heals divisions, and brings about the kind of world that we all really wish we could have. And some of us, and many of us, think, well, that's a nice story, Jamie, but it can't really be done. But when you deepen into what Sarge did and his methods, you begin to discover, wait a minute, there really is something here, and we need to recover that conversation, and we need to recover that approach and make it live. And that's, for me, the power of what you guys are doing and the power of this partnership with IOP, because it's basically saying, let's create a space where we can think these thoughts again, where we can recover Sarge, not only the wonderful man that he was, but the kind of legacy that he can have if we do that. Mm-hmm. So that's why.
His biography includes many of the points that Bill mentioned and many of the items that are on this screen here. And that's not the totality of them. But you'll notice, for those of you who are interested in another aspect of his biography, that there's a deep Chicago connection. You can see the 3 principal positions he held here. But let's go to actually a little video that describes his time in this city, which is important for understanding the seeds of his public service and how he worked in the world.
And why this project is here.
Exactly.
Sarge was running a Kennedy-owned merchandise mart. Shriver became president of the Board of Education, and he led a Catholic civil rights organization that challenged Catholic hospitals and schools to desegregate.
Promote integration.
Chicago's news editors were touting Shriver for governor, but all bets were off when Eunice's father asked Sarge for help on his son Jack's presidential bid.
It can't have been easy for a guy who, throughout the 1950s, had been building a very powerful political career, and many people were talking about him as being the next governor or senator from Illinois. And he marries into this uber political family, the Kennedy family, and all of a sudden he has to take a back seat to all the aspirations of Jack and Bobby and Ted. For a lot of people with political aspirations, that wouldn't have been something they could have done and survived. They would have become resentful or bitter. Shriver was able to both be a very loyal family member while at the same time retaining, for the most part, his own political identity as well.
Bill, tell me more about that, as you understand, his relationship with the larger Kennedy family and both the opportunities and limits that were placed on him as he thought about his own career.
Well, this is such a complicated story that, you know, what I can say here really is superficial, I suppose. But, you know, there are no question but that both Joseph P. Kennedy, in giving Sarge responsibility for what was by far the most significant investment the Kennedy family had ever made, and
in the merchandise market.
In the merchandise mart, to the point actually when it became desirable to sell the merchandise mart many, many, many years later, when Sarge had left public life, whom did the family turn to sell the merchandise mart? They turned to Sarge. The other important aspect of the relationship was the esteem that JFK held him in. And that esteem is demonstrated by several crucial incidents. And these crucial incidents also explain the difficulties that Sarge encountered, which we will cover when we get to the session that deals with whether the Peace Corps would be independent, stand on its own feet.
Session 4.
The first and perhaps the most important of these was the Martin Luther King, Mrs. Martin Luther King telephone call, which is covered in your materials. This Martin Luther King, who had been a friend of Sarge's, there are wonderful pictures of Sarge and Martin Luther King in Chicago in the context of the integration of the Chicago public schools. This is a relationship that goes back into the 50s. It's not a relationship of two Johnny-come-latelys. So Harris Wofford, who's a very important figure in the Peace Corps story, and Louis Martin, who's an extremely important Chicago figure with an executive with the Sengstack newspapers, the Chicago Defender, which was in those days the black newspaper in Chicago, very important, conceived of the idea that JFK should call Mrs. Martin Luther King, and that JFK should make an effort to ensure King's safety, having been jailed in Alabama. In your materials is a piece of oral history of Sarge's that only came to light quite recently, but it is a step-by-step account of how he pulled this off, how he got out of the bedroom where he was with Jack, the people whom he was sure would oppose this initiative, the political operatives, wedded to what might call traditional Democratic Party constituency thinking.
the time the Democrats dominated the South.
At the time, the Democrats dominated the South. At the time, the South, the Solid South, was regarded as crucial to the election of any Democratic president. And at the time where there was this incredible cleavage between the segregationists in the South, controlled the Senate, incidentally, and the House, and the liberals, represented probably most notably by Hubert Humphrey, who represented the Northern Democrats. So Sarge suggests to JFK that he call Martin Luther King and Mrs. Martin Luther King, and Jack immediately grasps the political significance of that. That is what is so extraordinary. Do you have her telephone number? Yes, I do. A little thing like that proves to be so crucial. Get her on the phone. So the telephone call takes place. There's a wonderful book by a Princeton scholar called Goodbye to the Party of Lincoln, which traces the migration politically of Southern blacks from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, beginning in the 30s with the Depression, continuing in the 40s with the employment opportunities that the war created and military service, and into the 50s with the post-war boom. But that migration had not translated itself into black Democratic votes in the South. The day after the phone call, which Robert Kennedy violently opposed, attacked JFK, attacked Sarge, you've lost the election for us. Thinking about, of course, the white, solid Democratic South. Martin Luther King's father, Martin Luther King Sr., in a national press conference, says that if President Kennedy can take the time to call my daughter-in-law, I'm delivering a bag full of votes to him, as many as I possibly can. Well, if you look at the election statistics, you will see, for example, that the fact that JFK carried Alabama, which is in somewhat dispute, and Illinois, which also is in somewhat dispute, elected him president.
I mean, it's astonishing to think about, and the roots of this relationship stem from his time in Chicago.
That's correct.
And I want to get to the other elements of the 60 campaign where we introduced the Peace Corps, but to stay on this point for just a second, Jamie, what was it that shaped Sarge's own thinking and his own relationships with African Americans and his own thinking around integration, around racial equality, around racial justice, et cetera, at a time when that was certainly not the majority opinion for many whites in certain parts of the country, and was a politically risky position in a city like Chicago?
As I think it's hard to say exactly, but it's clear from evidence early on that Sarge was interested in and opposed to the kind of structural injustices of discrimination in the U.S. That all the way back to Baltimore. He used to work with his father and go around and do service in the black communities. It had a lot to do with his commitment to the human dignity and equality of all people. One of the reasons that he became a member of and then the president of the Chicago Catholic Interracial Society was because he was convinced that racism was a sin, and he was called to do something about that. His own sense of compassion led him to do that, and he was, as the film indicated, a key figure in integrating the Catholic high schools and hospitals here in Chicago. He was a major force behind Cardinal Stritch coming out and declaring racism a sin and moving the hierarchy in that way. And so too in 1960, during the campaign, to be able to look across and to see how racial politics had put Martin Luther King in jail. Not only was he a friend, but he had been committed to that issue for a decade and more, and it was natural for him.
Yeah. So I just want to highlight a couple of themes. We're going to come back to these themes, but Jamie mentioned this idea of compassion. We've heard about this idea of service. Bill talked about a set of values rooted in his faith tradition that sort of are applied across his life in these ways. So keep those in mind as we go forward. I want to then come to the specific idea of the Peace Corps. We're going to come to the 1960 campaign. But Bill, where did the concept of a Peace Corps, of Americans volunteering abroad, actually come from? What are the seeds?
Well, there are seeds of it, indeed. First of all, a program called International Voluntary Services actually had rural development workers working in Vietnam in the 50s. Henry Royce, who was a representative from Wisconsin, and Hubert Humphrey felt very strongly that the Eisenhower-Dulles mutual security foreign policy, which was embodied in successive mutual security acts that were designed to finance Cold War containment efforts around the globe. You know, NATO, CENTO, CETO, all of these treaties that Dulles signed up to surround the country, the Soviet Union with. They felt that they had robbed the United States of the altruism that was embodied in President Truman's Point 4 program, providing technical assistance to the developing world. That technical assistance had been smothered in mutual security. So they had a bill. They had a bill for a Point 4 Youth Corps, which financed the study that we've not been able to find, even though it's mentioned in your materials.
And I should pause here to say, when we're referring to materials, many of you who were here last week, if you should have received materials and archival documents related to session 1. We also have documents up for session 2, and there'll be similar archival documents like the one that's up here on the screen for all of the sessions going forward. So anybody who's not signed up through Eventbrite or on an email list, I'll leave a sheet here. Make sure to leave your email here so we can get you those documents because they're fascinating.
So this study was commissioned by Colorado State through a competitive process, but unfortunately didn't get delivered until mid-February of '61, when we were already well launched with the Peace Corps Task Force.
We think of this as a Kennedy program developed by Sargent Shriver, but in September of 1960, LBJ actually makes reference to a similar idea during a speech at the University of Nebraska. And here we have, again, in your documents, a page from that speech where he's talking in a context of a Cold War, context of significant heightened international tension. We mentioned last week, we're talking about in the immediate aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the leading up to, rather, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're talking about Sputnik. We're talking about the Iron Curtain. All of this is swirling around in international affairs. And LBJ says to the students at University of Nebraska, among other things, he says, we need a Volunteers for Peace and Humanity program sponsored by our government, and we need it without delay. We need to offer our young people an opportunity to serve humanity in the remote stretches of the world after they graduate from school. It would be of service not only to the cause of peace, but to the enrichment of their own lives. It would cost our government little to tap the rich mainstream of young Americans' idealism, but the rewards would be rich beyond comparison. That sounds idealized, but there's also, I'm sure, a very, very strategic, practical element to a call for service, because this is about winning the hearts and minds of the rest of the world in this bipolar fight against the Soviet Union, is it not?
Well, it is, but the document, the speech, the background is somewhat mysterious. Bill Moyers, historically, despite entreaties from his wife Judith and from yours truly, refuses to write his memoirs. And he also refuses to take care of his archive. In fact, he's systematically destroying it.
He's destroying his papers.
He's destroying his papers. Every once in a while, he will send me something that he thinks I should have. And this speech is one of them. I had no idea that this speech existed.
We should say, Bill Moyers, key advisor to
LBJ,
LBJ, press secretary, all of those, speechwriter, all of those, yeah. In addition to his incredible career as a journalist.
What you really need to understand is he was the clean successor to Bobby Baker. You want to explain that to everybody? Bobby Baker was LBJ's fixer and got in an incredible amount of trouble. And so LBJ took this divinity student journalist out of the University of Texas and made him what he is today. Anyway, so I asked Bill, well, what's the context of the speech? And Bill shrugs. Something LBJ just wanted to do. It was just so typical of LBJ that this New Deal figure, this head of the National Youth Administration in Texas, this teacher at San Marcos State College, was always enthralled with youth and the potential of youth. And he made the speech. It didn't ripple anywhere. Actually, Barbara's brother Bob was there. Doesn't remember the speech.
Your wife's brother, yeah,
yes,
your brother-in-law.
My wife's brother, Bob, oldest brother Bob, was there. Doesn't remember the speech at all. So, you know, you have this notion that ideas are in the air, and they clearly are.
There's a review or a comment, I mean, in Harper's magazine in '65 that talks about Bill Moyers, and it references the speech. And it was the journalist who's writing that at the time said that Moyers said that speech was instrumental in Kennedy's thinking. But there are lots of theories.
But we have no evidence of that at all.
No.
And Bill does not say that Kennedy or anybody else picked up and did anything with the speech. It just sits there in September as a kind of an island to itself.
And now it sits here.
So we have these two references, the LBJ reference, the program that Bill referenced as well. And we're now, as we move forward in the chronology, we're now in the fall of 1960, in the throes of the presidential campaign between Vice President Richard Nixon and JFK. They have just this very night completed their third televised presidential debate on CBS. President Kennedy, or then Senator Kennedy, flies to an airport just outside of Detroit, drives to Ypsilanti, Michigan, delivers a talk in front of a throng of students at Eastern Michigan University. It's very late in the night. Imagine you've got the evening debate. He flies, he lands late at night in Detroit, drives to Ypsilanti, not far, but nevertheless, the talk's in Ypsilanti. And there's a room, he's scheduled to end the day in Ann Arbor, where he's going to sleep overnight on the campus of the University of Michigan. And students are now getting wind that this candidate for president will be in Ann Arbor, and they start amassing over the course of a cold, rainy night in campus, hoping to catch some glimpse of this candidate for president. And I will pick up the story here.
By now, it's around 1:30 in the morning, and according to the campaign itinerary, the next stop was the Michigan Union and sleep. But upon arrival, Kennedy discovered that there were thousands of students waiting for him. He would have to speak to them. But speak about what? His choice of topics would be historic. To choose this time and this place, to put forth an idea and challenge that he and others had been considering. What prompted that choice? According to Tom Hayden, who was then the editor of the Michigan Daily student newspaper, and would go on to become a famous activist, what prompted Kennedy was a letter that both he and other Michigan students had written to both presidential campaigns, asking about where they stood on a number of issues, including a national youth corps. One of those students was at the curb to personally deliver the letter to Kennedy.
Kennedy came down and he was introduced to the student, Dave McLeod, and McLeod told him what it was about. Kennedy opened the envelope, read the letter, this letter, and put in his pocket and said, "I'll be speaking to one of those points tonight."
And Kennedy simply mounted those steps. I stayed watching and listening at the bottom of the steps.
Can you imagine standing at 2 o'clock in the morning and a cold, drizzling night, seeing oceans of students in front of you and going, oh my gosh? The students were inspiring him.
He didn't speak all that long. First he opened up with a joke.
I want to express my thanks to you as a graduate of the Michigan of the East, Harvard University.
He instantly had us. He acknowledged us. He let us know that we were rightfully proud to be Michigan people. So he boosted us.
And then Kennedy shifted from seeking votes to issuing a challenge.
How many of you who are going to be doctors are willing to spend your days in Ghana, technicians or engineers? How many of you are willing to work in the Foreign Service and spend your lives traveling around the world? On your willingness to do that, not merely to serve 1 year or 2 years in the service, but on your willingness to contribute part of your life to this country, I think will depend the answer whether a free society can compete. I think it can, and I think Americans are willing to contribute. But the effort must be far greater than we've ever made in the past. And therefore I'm delighted to come to Michigan, this university, because unless we have those resources in this school, unless you comprehend the nature of what is being asked of you, this country can't possibly move through the next 10 years in a period of relative strength. So I come here tonight to go to bed, but I also come here tonight to ask you to join in the effort. This university this is the longest short speech I've ever made. May I just say in conclusion that this college, this university, is not maintained by its alumni, by the state, merely to help its graduates have an economic advantage in the life struggle. There is certainly a greater purpose, and I'm sure you recognize it, and therefore I do not asking for your support in this campaign. I come here tonight asking your support for this country over the next decade. Thank you.
Remarkable moment, a remarkable speech. Seemingly impromptu, if the setup is to be believed. What happens after this speech as he floats this idea of service in really quite broad and unspecific ways?
But clearly ways that are designed or intended to be a key contribution to making the world safe for freedom in the larger context. What happens is the students at the University of Michigan take up his challenge, and some of the student leaders that you saw drafted a petition saying, "Okay, you asked us to serve, we'll serve," and they wrote that petition up. They got a lot of people to sign it, and then intercepted Kennedy's campaign in Ohio. They dropped down from Michigan, and he received that petition, and from what I understand, that was the impetus for him to move it from an idea to an actual campaign promise, which he then delivered shortly thereafter at a speech in the Cow Palace in San Francisco.
I just want to put a fine point on this. I mean, we're sitting here in the midst of a presidential campaign right now. Candidates crisscrossing the country. We're hoping to have as many as we possibly can lure down to this university to speak to our students over the course of the coming months, but certainly they're coming through town. Students writing a letter, handing it to a candidate. Students responding to a candidate's call for a certain kind of service with great specificity, going out of their way to try and get their ideas, their petition in front of leaders in a campaign, traveling to an adjacent state to do so. Students just like you in this room, sitting here, thinking about no different, yeah. And that action, however large or small you want to deem it to be, created more momentum for what then becomes a more robust idea and proposal in that campaign, right? And we get to ultimately the Cow Palace speech. Bill, set up the Cow Palace speech if you can.
Well, we start again at the University of Michigan with, I think, a document that's in the syllabus that University of Michigan professor Sam Hayes, in September again, before this incident at the University of Michigan Student Union, writes a paper about service and the importance of service for young people. Somehow, I don't know how, a very, very important Michigan United Auto Workers figure, a legend, Millie Jeffries, knew about that letter and got a copy from Sam and gave it to Ted Sorensen. And on the basis of Ted's experience at the University of Michigan, which you've seen, and the letter, and Ted's knowledge of the Humphrey Royce proposal, he writes what has become the Cow Palace speech, which is completely devoted to advocacy of what President Kennedy then called in that speech the Peace Corps.
Let's take a listen. See if I can get my cursor going here.
Just 6 days before the election, 40,000 people packed the Cow Palace in San Francisco to hear the speech. It was the height of the Cold War, and foreign policy was the #1 issue. Soviet aggression and the threat of a nuclear war were very real. Intense competition was being waged by the two superpowers for the hearts and minds of the Third World. To help win that competition, in his speech, Kennedy formally proposed the Peace Corps, saying, quote, "When I suggested at the University of Michigan that we needed young men and women willing to give up a few years to serve their country in this fashion, the students proposed a new organization to promote such an effort. Others have indicated a similar response, offering a tremendous pool of talent that could work modern miracles for peace in dozens of underdeveloped nations."
It was the only foreign aid policy program that Kennedy had committed to in the course of the campaign.
Without the University of Michigan students picking up the ball that he had thrown in ambiguous ways, with no plan in his mind, a general idea, and saying, we will go if you form a service program overseas.
Kennedy wouldn't have included that in the speech, and if he didn't include that in the speech, there would be no Peace Corps.
That's the Cow Palace speech. 6 days later, of course, Kennedy narrowly wins election, and then has to figure out how to move on this idea that he has embraced so prominently late in the campaign, and turns to his brother-in-law. And I wonder if we should...
First he turns to his brother-in-law for arguably a more important task, which is another one of the seeds of tension between Robert Kennedy and Sargent Shriver. That is to say, the morning after the election, Kennedy convenes his closest political advisors at breakfast and makes assignments. And the last assignment is to Sarge. He commissioned Sarge to staff the government. And this, so the story goes, just infuriated Bobby because, first of all, Bob thought Sarge was a lightweight. And secondly, he saw all the potential patronage that he thought was going to be his being drained away by this person who was committed to making decisions on the basis of merit.
And he then comes, let's play this little clip here. He then comes to the matter of the Peace Corps.
I'd gone back to Chicago when the phone rang. Was the president on there, and he called a couple of times, and finally my wife said, "Sarge, you got to talk to Jack now. Remember, he's the president." And so I said, "Well, all right, I will." So about the third time I got on the phone, he said, "Listen, you've got to come down here to Washington and run the Peace Corps." I said, "Well, Mr. President, you know, I don't know anything about any Peace Corps." And he said, "Well, that's all right, neither does anybody else." And I said, "But yes, but remember all the political debts you incurred during the campaign. Why don't you give this job to one of your political friends?" He said, "Listen, Sarge, the truth of the matter is that everybody thinks the Peace Corps is going to be one of the greatest fiascos in history. It turns out that way. It's much easier to fire a relative than a political friend."
Why did he really turn to Sarge for this task?
Well, I think for exactly those reasons.
Really?
I think
You
that
think
Sarge, first of all, had demonstrated, not just with the Martin Luther King telephone call, but with also a little-known story that also was the seeds of some animosity between Sarge and Bob. When JFK got the nomination, he asked Sarge quietly to go and find out if Johnson would accept the vice presidency. And the theory that nobody would notice that particular emissary on that particular mission, which was correct. And Sarge went and came back with the word that Johnson would accept the vice presidency. And JFK then, without talking to Bobby, offered it to him, which infuriated Bobby, because Bobby thought that Johnson's Southern roots would alienate traditional Democratic voters in the North. Turned out to be actually completely wrong, but nevertheless. So Sarge had proved himself in a number of ways. He'd proved himself running the MART, he'd proved himself with the Chicago School Board and integration, he had proved himself with the telephone call, he had proved himself by staffing the cabinet, by finding people like Rusk, McNamara, Wirtz. So here was somebody who had demonstrated his ability to get it done. And of course, he could be sacrificed. He could be sacrificed with no political cost whatsoever.
Let me, if I can, to move our conversation along, read the relevant passages from the State of the Union address, the first State of the Union address that John F. Kennedy delivers to Congress as president, that happens just a few weeks after this chronology, in which he, late in the address, comes back to this idea of the Peace Corps. This is really the only reference to it here. But he says, "We cannot escape our dangers, neither must we let them drive us into panic or narrow isolation. In many areas of the world where the balance of power already rests with our adversaries, the forces of freedom are sharply divided. It is one of the ironies of our time that the techniques of a harsh and repressive system should be able to instill discipline and ardor in its servants, while the blessings of liberty have too often stood for privilege, materialism, and a life of ease. But I have a different view of liberty. Life in 1961 will not be easy. Wishing it, predicting it, even asking for it will not make it so. There will be further setbacks before the tide is turned, but turn it we must. The hopes of all mankind rest upon us, not simply upon those of us in this chamber, but upon the peasant in Laos, the fisherman in Nigeria, the exile from Cuba, the spirit that moves every man and nation who share our hopes for freedom in the future. And in the final analysis, I can't see, what is it? They rest most of all upon the pride and perseverance of our fellow citizens of the great republic. Take us into the significance of these words, what he's alluding to here.
He has a short paragraph a little bit before in the speech where he talks about the Peace Corps itself, but what's good about this one is it shows the context in which he understood it. There is a life and death struggle for freedom going on, and he has proposed, he's promised the Peace Corps as a key answer to that. So when he calls Sarge on January 21st, the day after he's been inaugurated, to pick up the challenge of starting the Peace Corps, he is really putting a major burden on him. Because as was said in a previous clip, Kennedy didn't have a plan for this, but he was confident that Sarge could figure it out. And Sarge said, hey, I don't know anything about this Peace Corps, and as we said earlier, he was probably wanting to run for governor, run for senator, get settled back in the merchandise mart and his life in Chicago. Instead, he has a call to service. But the thing that is interesting to think about is here you have a Cold War going on. It's been going on for some time. It's quite serious on a nuclear level. It's quite serious militarily. But the view of Kennedy certainly, and Johnson in the speech that Steve referenced earlier, was that there's a whole uncommitted part of the world. A third of the world is communist, a third of the world is free, and a third of the world is just emerging. And who are they?
Explicitly non-aligned.
Non-aligned.
Explicitly non-aligned.
And so the issue was, how do you get them aligned? Because what's at stake is a way of life, liberty, and you get them aligned by a call to service. You get them aligned by asking Americans to give their talents and their energies to fixing this. Well, that's great, but what are we talking about when we're doing that? And not only that, it's taken seriously. I mean, now, 50 years later, we think of the Peace Corps as a nice option if you want to serve or you want to go somewhere in the world, but I think the thing that's significant about the passage that you raised is that this was a serious policy proposal in a State of the Union speech which was delivered in a sense of being under siege. And so he called, and of course the State of the Union speech happened 10 days after he called Sarge, or 9 days after he called Sarge, and Sarge had already said, all right, I'll figure this out. And now he's announcing it's going to,
so yeah, to underscore your point, this is not just the idea of service, because this is something that we should all do as citizens of the world. This is a very specific answer to a very real and dangerous problem.
Right.
And I want to come to this quote really quickly because I think it captures very succinctly the sense of the challenge that lay before Sarge, as you alluded to it. President Kennedy had not even given me a bill. I had only 4 or 5 sentences from a campaign speech in California to go on, or Michigan, or the Cal Palace, right, in San Francisco. It was like seeing a picture of a cake and then being told to bake one. There were no ingredients, no measurements, no idea even of what kinds of substances it should include. Here, take this idea and figure it out.
Right.
Right?
And so, of course, that's an extraordinary leadership challenge. It's the challenge that leaders face all the time, which is, we've identified a problem. We might have an idea of how you might go about that, but we don't know the solution.
The specific look at that solution. Yeah. How does it operate in the world? Yeah.
Right. And so your task is not just to diagnose it, but to cure it.
Yeah.
I think it's important to underscore the fact that these challenges arise all the time in public service.
Right.
Just think of the challenge that the United States now confronts with this Russian initiative in Syria. What is the appropriate response to an extraordinarily complicated, messy situation? Well, as we know, our president is criticized for having not much of a response. one could look at you people and ask, well, if you were Shriver confronted with the Syrian challenge, with the values that he has, what do you think he would do? You could, I want to underscore a contextual point that Jamie alluded to, which I think needs more emphasis. It's hard for you to understand what life was like in the 40s and 50s. The Iron Curtain descends. Winston Churchill's very famous speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. The Russian rejection of the Baruch Plan for universal sharing of atomic energy information and elimination of atomic weapons. The attempted communist insurrection in Greece, which prompted the first United States foreign aid program ever, even before the Marshall Plan. So all of these events, all of these challenges are taking place throughout the world, in Asia with difficulties between the Chinese communists and the Kuomintang, in India, specifically a non-aligned country, in Indonesia, specifically a non-aligned country, in Africa, where there is intense competition for the loyalties of the emerging nations, in Latin America, where you have communist revolutionaries actually, not just in Cuba, but everywhere. And remember that only weeks after the State of the Union address, you have the Bay of Pigs. And shortly thereafter, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the context in which these proposals were made is a context that probably is only becoming more familiar to you because of what has happened in the Crimea and Ukraine and in Syria. But these were extraordinarily real challenges at that time, when I wasn't actually much older than you are. So for Kennedy to decide explicitly to reclaim the word peace and to use service as a way of trying to achieve peace is an extraordinary thing. Perhaps it reflects, you know, the upbringing that he had at the hands of his father. He and his brothers, both Bob and Ted, were inculcated with the notion of the obligation of public service by their father from the beginning.
I want to stop here really quickly. First of all, what questions do you have about anything? I know we're doing a lot of chronology and history, but this is all setting the stage. What questions do you have about anything that happened? Yes?
I was wondering about, if your intentions are political, does that undermine the idea of spreading peace in terms of like getting this 1/3 to align with you? Does it undermine the idea of like doing what's good for the world?
I had a revelation actually in a museum in Frankfurt 2 weeks ago, the big art museum in Frankfurt, which has an extraordinary collection, but the exhibition in the museum was of East and West German art of the 80s. And this was the most intensely dramatic, political art that I had ever seen. Now, why am I thinking of this? I'm thinking of this because you walk through a museum and it starts, you know, with the Renaissance Catholic religious icons, right? And then it continues to show the rise of the middle class that Rembrandt painted, for example. And then, you know, the environment of the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. It made me realize that all art is political. That Catholic art of the Renaissance is highly political, just as political in its own way as were the paintings of the East and West Germans in the 80s, What I'm trying to convey to you is that everything is political. Nothing is not political.
And the issue is, and that's absolutely true, but does the politics that you're representing reinforce the sense of threat you have from the person who's saying it, or does it present it in a way that makes you open to other kinds of connections and relationships? And that was the key that Sarge.
I also think, though, your question, I think you should hold on to it, because I think it actually has direct relevance to the way in which the Peace Corps is set up and established within the framework of the U.S. government, and what influences everything budgetarily, to structurally, to oversight come to bear on its operation in the world. Is there, I think, foreshadowing, there are struggles and philosophical disagreements over how it should live in the world that speak to your question and the degrees in which soft power politics are driving this versus other values. Yeah.
I would just say also it was probably more of a consideration for Kennedy,
Yeah.
not for Sarge.
Sarge, right,
For Sarge, it wasn't about the politics. Not at least at the same extent as it might have been for Kennedy.
What I want to do is have you come back to this quote here for a second. And imagine yourself as Shriver in early 1961. You have now been asked by the President of the United States, your brother-in-law, to design this program that is based on little else than 4 or 5 sentences from a campaign speech. What do you do first? Where do you begin? What do you think? There's no right or wrong answer. Where would you go? Here's your task. I need you to create this thing.
Come on, somebody's got to launch themselves into the
What are the
Go
I
ahead.
mean, it
Yes.
may not be the first thing.
Go.
What are the things you would need to do?
I mean, first of all, you need to formulate the goal, what you actually want to achieve, because what has been said in the campaign speech remained pretty vague.
Interesting. Okay, so you need to clarify more specifically what the specific goals and objectives are. What else? Yes.
Yeah, kind of address the problems. I think they both knew, Sarge and J&K knew that they had the support from the youth, so they had that covered. So I think it was really addressing the problems in the world at the moment, at the time, and kind of seeing, you know, where they wanted to put you, or they wanted to, you know, kind of institute the changes so they have the most impact on the world and on peace as a whole.
So look at a map of the world,
Right, exactly.
get out and travel. Yeah. We'll come to you next.
What other resources other than actual people do you need,
Yeah.
and what support would you potentially need?
Right, right. So what do you mean by support?
Whether it's like political from the U.S. government, or travel, or even within those countries, those governments approving you coming in.
Right, you got to get buy-in from countries. You have to get buy-in from other political leaders. And Neri?
Figuring out how to do like a sustainable and meaningful opportunity for both the people engaging in the program and then the beneficiaries of the program.
Right, right. I mean, this thing, you might be able to get it off the ground, and it could be successful for a year. But then what? How do you actually make it viable? How do you also insulate it from a new administration or changing political winds?
I guess another important thing is, since there's no internet, you have to go places to let people know that this is happening, because people aren't necessarily reading a local Michigan newspaper in South Carolina.
Right. How are you recruiting the volunteers for this? How are you recruiting the countries to host you?
Yeah, not only do you need domestic political support, but also you need to go to the countries that you want support and ask them in the first place, do you actually want this?
Right. Can we come in and do this kind of work at a time when there was, to your earlier point, and forgive me, I didn't have your name close enough. Akash. Maybe there was some skepticism in some of these countries as to what the United States was up to.
Well, I have to
offering.
say something about the remark about the internet. All of you seem to have forgotten that in the 60s there were things called radio, television, newspapers, word of mouth. They seem to have proved very effective. 30,000 applications in the first 6 months.
There were thousands of people writing in to join the Peace Corps before it had even started officially.
Thousands of people writing in. So people, we saw that from the students in their petition at the University of Michigan. There was a hunger for this idea. They wanted to participate. You don't even know what to plug them into at this point. And you don't know if there are countries that are going to be willing to accept. You don't know how it's structured. You don't know if there will be political support. Is there opposition on the other side of the aisle? Are there, frankly, leaving aside even ideological opposition, are there turf battles? And we'll get to a lot of that as it plays out. Jamie, I think in many respects, Sarge started with goals and objectives, did he not? Yeah, you want to take us through?
He did. Well, could you go back to that?
Yeah.
Right. The one thing I guess I want to, all of those points are excellent. They all need to be addressed. The point I'd like to highlight is this distinction between seeing a picture of a cake and then being told to bake one. The difference between figuring out how to how to devise a recipe and using a recipe, how to create a solution and then implementing the solution. We often slide to technique, to recipes, to things we already know, to try to apply them to a situation. Sarge knew, because he was given this task, that he had to have a framework, a method for solving a problem that didn't at this point have an answer. And so that's one of the key things that he had to have. And I highlight it as much for, I don't know if it's historically particularly interesting, but it's key for the program that we're trying to do here, that the fellows in the past year and fellows in the coming year will be put in a situation in which you'll have a problem that doesn't really have a solution. You'll need to wrestle with it and need to be able to think of, like, well, how do you create a recipe? How do you discover, what's the framework that you need to discover? It's called a method in science, right? Scientific method is a way of organizing our thinking so that we can answer questions that we don't have answers to. Sarge had a method for social change. It's, and he starts with this one. Or he sets it up. Well, you can go. We should probably do that one. I'm sorry.
Which one?
Oh,
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to smooth it forward. This is hypersensitive.
This is from a speech that he gave to Council on Foreign Relations, and basically they were challenging him to say, what can a Peace Corps do? How in the world can a Peace Corps make any difference? And so it takes him to the question of method, really. And so he says, let's ask the question in a different way. What's going to change the world? If you believe people must live in harmony in this conflict-ridden world, how's that going to come about? Guns won't change the world. That's one of the great lessons of this bloody century. Dollar bills won't change the world. You can't buy peace. You can't fight your way to peace. Nor can you wish your way there, nor will simple goodwill. His answer, I think is on the next slide, is this one. He says, the fact is that compassion and service can dissolve obstacles of race or belief anywhere in the world. People are hungry for contact, for fellowship, for the breaking down of barriers. That's the framework. And there's a lot of filling out to do here, but this is basically the framework that Sarge brought to his problem-solving situations. He knew, or he knew that if you can somehow structure the activities of the people who want to volunteer so that what they're doing are acts of compassion and service, you'll be able to create peace. How to do that was another question, what you come up with.
All this is very well and good, you know, and I don't intend at all to detract from it. It's an important, essential element of Sarge's nature. And I think of the nature of anybody who sets out to do something that's difficult, let alone something that never has really been done before. But there are a whole other series of questions that you cannot ignore. Think about the metaphor of baking a cake. Well, where is this cake to be baked? It's not to be baked in an oven. It's to be baked in the context of government, the United States government. So what are the questions that cake baking in the United States government raises? Well, they are essentially questions of power and authority. What is the authority, the legal authority, in the United States to create a Peace Corps? What is the authority to empower a director of the Peace Corps? These are very fundamental questions that he also had to confront. It wasn't sufficient, to have a notion of a cake. It had to be a cake in context, and the context was the context of extraordinarily complicated institution known as the United States government.
By the way, I encourage everybody who hasn't already picked one up to come up here and grab a copy of the syllabus, because it describes in considerable detail not only the timeline of events that will move us through these sessions, but also the sessions that speak to the critical concerns that Bill outlined as well. There was a set of institutional questions, navigating questions of power and authority. We have a set of questions that have to do with how you actually get buy-in internationally. We have a set of questions that have to do with how do you operationalize this thing? How do you recruit volunteers? What should they be trained? What should they be assigned to do? What's the approach they should take when actually receiving their placements? So I want to make sure that all of you have a copy of that if you don't already. I want to come back, though, before we move on to the institutional things, which is where I'd like to end. I want to come to power and authority and structure as we end. Let me stay with compassion and service for a second, just so we have a deeper sense of how these philosophies guide the way in which Sarge will try to answer those other questions and carve out space for this program to be successful in his view. I'll let you walk us through this, but do you want to go on a comparative method or do you want to go to compassion?
I guess we could stay for a second on comparative method. I just want to say that I completely agree with Bill and the points he was making. It's just that you have to have the recipe to deal with those questions.
Yeah.
And so the point that's hard, or I think difficult, is to recognize that you can talk about compassion and service in a critical way, in a way that's not just sort of loosey-goosey and oh how nice, but that to say, well, this is what it means to be compassionate, and this is what it means to serve, and if you do it in critically controlled ways, methodologically controlled ways, the probability of creating peace is really good. And to be able to think about that. Sarge was able to do that. And so I created this slide, and basically it's to be somewhat provocative and just to say, we've seen the first part, the fact is compassion and service can dissolve obstacles. I just made it as a parallel to scientific method to show you where I'm coming from in this, which is, and where the program is, which is the fact is, swapping out compassion and service for mathematical reasoning and quantitative analysis can solve problems of physics, chemistry, biology, and a host of other things anywhere in the world. People are hungry for knowledge of discovery, for knowledge for discovery, for the breaking down of scientific barriers. So that he isn't just stating platitudes. He's
not saying let's just go hug it out.
No, no, he's not. Now, there are a lot of further relevant questions about what in the world he means by that. And then there are a couple of slides saying he really means it.
These are all Sarge quotes. So
yes, yeah.
Help us understand how he thought about this idea of compassion working in the world.
Well, to be honest, he thought that human beings are intrinsically and inherently compassionate as long as they're open to the greater flow of compassion in the world, which was spiritual. And that's why the first quotation is, for the saints and sages of the great religions have always agreed that a peace that passes understanding can be reached only by compassion.
This is not a uniquely Catholic idea.
He is Catholic, and he went to Mass every day. He was a member of the cathedral down on Rush, I think it is, and he went and he received Mass every day up until the day he died. He had Alzheimer's, as you know, and one of the last things that he remembered were the words from the Mass before he passed away. But his claim is that it's only with this compassion that man can look upon man through the mask of many colors, through the vestments of many religions, through the dust of poverty, or through the disfigurement of disease, and recognize his brother. This is the ideal that must illuminate from the very center all our efforts to bring a better life to our world, within our own country, and in the farthest reaches of the planet. So to get back to your earlier question about why Sarge, for me at any rate, this is an extraordinarily inspiring position to take. And the fact that it wasn't just a platitude, but that he then turned around and with Bill's help and with many other people's help, built numerous programs on these principles, which continue to work today, is cool.
A theory of change rooted in his own belief in human nature.
Human nature.
I mean, there are other great philosophers who would argue there's a different human nature, right? But he's also going after this lofty goal here. He's asking the question a different way. It's not just how do I create a Peace Corps.
Yeah.
It's how do you change the world, right?
How do you change the world?
It's to the first comment you made, it's the biggest goal. He's identified the biggest possible overarching goal.
Yeah, and literally
as the objective for the Peace Corps.
How do you change the world? And the world is the Cold War world.
Yeah.
And Kirby Jones last week, Peace Corps volunteer in Dominican Republic, said any number of times, what was it about Sarge that he thought he could send 23, 24, 25-year-olds? Bill has said to me, what did Sarge see in this 26-year-old UC grad attorney that he would choose me? Well, he was a very discerning man in terms of talent on the one hand, but the other thing was he didn't think we were out there all alone. He thought if you could position people to actually be doing compassionate and serving things, you're tapping into a well of power and spirit that would make a difference. So he was just confident. He didn't think he had to control Kirby. He didn't think he had to control people. He was freed to say, if we can set it up so that people can operate in conjunction with what he would have called, he's drawing on Catholic theology, cooperative grace, we'll be good. Not that there aren't risks, not that people don't die, not that people don't suffer, not that he didn't suffer, but he didn't think you could change the world without that.
Let's come to the other piece of this, service. What's his conception of service, Jim?
Well, if you can genuinely take a compassionate point of view, and by that I don't just mean feel things, I mean if you can position yourself, Sarge later in his career called, break the mirrors that constrain your own reflection back to yourself. If you can actually be curious about another person in their own terms, if you can, without surrendering your own position, but be able to wonder about another person. He thought it took compassion to do that. If you can actually do that and understand another person and what they need and make yourself available to that, you will want to serve. That's what you will do.
Which brings us to this idea here. This practical idealism, I want to tease on this. There's a sense of, we've just heard the idealized part of this.
Yeah.
Compassion and service, rooted in a perception of human nature that leads to possibilities for profound individual and global change. The practical side of this is what? Help us understand this.
Well, the practical side, I think, could be epitomized by something that he often said. He said, with 5 people, you can accomplish anything. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Look what they're doing.
And what he wrote about that, or said in the speech, was, reflecting back, of course, youthful enthusiasm and noble purposes were not enough. It wasn't just the cheers of the University of Michigan students. It wasn't just the noble purposes like I've been talking about. They had to be combined with hard-headed pragmatism and realistic imagination. I'm sorry, administration. Thank you. In the early days of the Peace Corps, we were looking for a formula for practical idealism.
We're going to talk more about the practical aspects of this. One of the things I think that's fascinating about Shriver, and it relates to really any problem that and any approach to social change in the world today is there's often seen as a divide between those who are playing within institutions and those who are working outside of institutions to seek change. And certainly in activist communities across the spectrum, there's often a debate about co-option, about access, about influence, about levers of power, access to power, mechanisms to create change. And often these two worlds see themselves as oppositional. That is to say, in order to really affect profound social change, you have to resist institutions, you have to resist the normal levels of power. Look at actually what surrounded the Occupy movement. Decidedly, very, very proudly, diffuse in its structure, diffuse in its goal setting, very much a communal approach to change and to attention-raising consciousness. What's interesting about Shriver is he's bringing similar ideals, high ideals, profound vision of change, and is working inside and outside. So he's working within the levers of power. He's trying to move the machinery of government, which we'll hear much more about in our next session, while holding on to a theory of change that is big, bold, and idealized. To me, practical idealism.
Unlike the Occupy movement, which prided itself on not having an agenda and therefore didn't accomplish much, Sarge had an agenda. It's important to have agenda. It's important to have goals. It's important to figure out how to achieve those goals.
We are at full time for this session. The three of us will stick around for informal conversation and questions about anything that today's session has surfaced for you. But I want to foreshadow next week's session and have everyone here pass around. Where did I put that document? Forgive me. Oh, they're right here. I want to pass around this. We're actually going to ask all of you to do a little reading as you go. I'll actually divide this in half. Do a little reading in advance of next week's session. We have 3 proposals. Bill's the best person to speak to this because he wrote one of them, co-wrote one of them. 3 proposals that came back to Shriver. He commissioned as he assembled a team that provide a design and a framework for what the Peace Corps should be. So he convened people, asked for a plan. We have 3 plans here: the Hayes plan, the Milliken plan, the Wiggins and Josephson plan. I would like, let's see, let's have this group, this table here. You will be the Hayes group. We'll have this second table be the Milliken group, and I'm going to include you, sir, with that. I'm going to leave this week's fellows out. So, Milliken group. So you and these 2 will be Milliken. And I'll have you be the Wiggins-Josephson cohort, the 4 of you. Your assignment is to read the report, just this one report that's assigned to you.
You can read them all.
Yeah, you can read them all, absolutely.
It's important to read them all, I think,
but
because the contrast is important.
Yes, so, but what we're going to do to, for the purposes of this exercise, you're welcome to read them all. But next week, we'll come here, we'll have one person from each group, maybe several of you, talk about the salient points in your respective reports. So I want you guys to talk about what's interesting about the Hayes report, what's Hayes's design and theory of the case. We'll do the same for the others. And then we will talk about the questions that are handed out and going around the room. As you read the document, my apologies, Siri. As you read the documents, do so with those questions in mind. How does this particular proposal hew to the objectives that President Kennedy set forth? How do these hew to the ideals that helped animate Sargent Shriver's approach to public service? We'll come back, we'll have a long discussion about that with all of us. Then we're going to move into some great behind-the-scenes accounts from Bill about what went into these and what came of them as we go into next week.
So the 4th document that we'll be looking at next time, and I encourage you to read that too, is the program for the Peace Corps that emerged from this. These documents came to the task force, were absorbed and transformed into the
plan.
The plan.
Yeah, yeah. Any final thoughts before I let you go?
No. I think it's
Thank you all so much for being here. We'll see you back here at noon next Friday.